Hi, I'm Brian Feltman, and I'm a member of the program committee for this year's International Society for First World War Studies virtual conference. This year, we're talking to authors of significant upcoming projects, and I'm here today with Jason Crouthamel, author of the forthcoming book, Trauma, Religion, and Spirituality in Germany During the First World War, which will be published with Bloomsbury Academic in October 2021. Jason, please tell us a bit about your background and your current positions.
Yeah, thanks for the interview, Brian. I appreciate it. I earned my PhD many years ago at Indiana University, and I've published in the history of shell shock in Germany, or they call that war neurosis or war hysteria in Germany. I published on the history of masculinity and the history of memory and trauma. I'm a professor currently at Grand Valley State University in Michigan.
All right. How did trauma, religion, and spirituality in Germany during the First World War originate?
Well, a number of years ago, I was at a conference on shell shock, and I was inspired by a keynote given by Jay Winter, who I think his job is to inspire people with his keynotes. And it worked for me because he said that one of the last kind of frontiers we have for the history of the First World War is studying the history of religion and its a role in helping ordinary men and women to deal with trauma and war. And I have to confess, I was a little bit skeptical at first. I think it related to my own biases about the importance of religion in the modern world. But when I went a couple of weeks later to the archives to complete research for my book on masculinity, I realized Jay Winter, as usual, was completely right. Letters by German soldiers, their diaries, were just dripping with references to religion, God, Jesus, salvation, their fears, their traumatic experiences were all discussed through that prism of religion. And I started to realize that religion was the primary language used by ordinary people, both men and women, to narrate, process, and cope with the stress of war. I became most interested in the function of religion in coping with trauma, less so in the content of religion, but more in how it functioned in helping people to deal with the stress of modern war, of trench warfare, and of stress on the home front. My focus started to really kind of crystallize around my interest in the history of emotions and the history of trauma.
Now, a number of recent studies have examined the role of religion and spirituality in the First World War. And what would you say sets your book apart from earlier studies?
In many ways, I see my book as building on some of the research recently on history of religion. The debate so far on the history of religion in World War I has largely focused on the question of whether or not the war stimulated or broke down or eroded religiosity. And I want to move away from that debate to look at some of the more complex religious effects of the war, beyond whether the war stimulated or eroded religious beliefs, this kind of dichotomy between the two. I want to explore how the war changed the ways in which men and women perceived their religious beliefs. How did religion serve as a form of self-therapy? And how was religion used as a language to express emotions resulting from wartime stress? Further, I wanted to shift away from the history of religion that focused on elites, the history from above, so to speak, religious leaders and chaplains, to a history from below. I'm not so interested in the debates between theologians about the significance of the war, right, for theories on religion. A number of historians have started to move in this direction. Alexander Watson's great book on Enduring the Great War, Patrick Houlihan's excellent work on the Catholic Church in World War I, started to take steps towards looking at how ordinary people processed war through religious language. And I want this to be the main focus of my study. In shifting the focus entirely onto the experiences of ordinary soldiers and civilians, looking at their letters, their diaries, front newspapers, we see a complex synthesis of traditional beliefs and new beliefs and rituals triggered by the front experience. Rather than eroding or stimulating religious beliefs, the war experience produced what one soldier in the trenches called something else, right? Something that many had a difficult time trying to define. We see in many cases a hybridization of Judeo-Christian, popular or folk beliefs, oftentimes called superstitions, right? In German, the word for superstition is Aberglauben, other beliefs, kind of a great broad term. We see pagan, especially for Germany, Nordic beliefs being incorporated in their experiences, and entirely new belief systems, I would say. So soldiers, for example, imagining their dead comrades intervening, right, to block bullets and artillery shells, kind of a Catholic notion of intercession from saints. But now men are imagining not so much the saints from their traditional belief systems, but their own dead friends who they feel this close connection to.
Right.
Soldiers oftentimes also started to attach a kind of a supernatural significance to technology, right? The experience, the environment of the trenches become the paraphernalia of religion, a kind of a hatred of, but also even a worship of, or addiction to the war experience. Ernst Jünger is the most famous example, of course. I would say one of the more interesting things that I found was that trauma in war allows us to see how religion gets modified, or even how new beliefs get invented to help people cope with stress. And that's my focus.
Okay. Well, in closing then, what do you think is the most important takeaway for scholars of the First World War as far as your project goes?
Right. In many ways, my book contributes to trauma studies as much as it does a history of religion. One of the key questions in trauma studies is, how do individuals cope with traumatic experiences outside of medical paradigms? So there's a lot of work on shell shock, war hysteria, right? But I would say that in studying trauma, it's much more complicated than what medicalized approaches would suggest. Ordinary people self-diagnose, they try to heal with the help of friends and families, using, for example, the language of religion, right? They treat themselves, right, through the intimate exchange of letters, where they share intimacy, vulnerability, right? They help to use rituals to give each other advice on how to deal with trauma. That's all outside of the sphere of medical diagnosis. It's a very personal, very intimate history. Also, thinking from a popular perspective, I've encountered from students and in talks I've given at libraries, that old axiom, people oftentimes raise their hand and say, you know, there are no atheists in foxholes, right? The kind of common adage. Germans had a similar, they said, a war teaches you how to pray, right? But I say it's much more complicated than that. War produced a broad spectrum of beliefs, right? Men in the trenches treated religion as a kind of a toolbox that could be reinforced or modified. If traditional beliefs worked, they would be used. If they had to invent new ones or modify old ones, right, they would develop this as part of their toolbox to cope with stress. Belief systems became much more individualized, much more detached from traditional structures and from authority figures. Individuals developed coping mechanisms themselves. They invented new ideas or modified new ideas to deal. Finally, religion, broadly defined, right, could help people to cope, but I found also that religion could produce a lot of anxiety, right? A lot of men and women ask these very fundamental questions that we see crop up in the terrifying experiences of the 20th century. Why don't traditional belief systems seem to make sense anymore? How could an all-powerful, benevolent God allow something like this, like war, to happen, right? And people struggled with those questions, right? Under extreme stress, they started to find oftentimes relief in new experiences. Comradeship, for example, bonding with friends started to feel more real than many of the traditional beliefs did. Right? Hopefully my book, I think one of the larger things I hope to get out of it is that it'll shed light on how human beings become psychologically resilient, even the most terrifying conditions. That's a question I'm focusing on World War I and German society. But I think beyond just German history, it hopefully will shed some light on how people use their belief systems or change their belief systems to become resilient and deal with unprecedented, unparalleled violence.
All right. Well, thank you for taking a few minutes to speak with us today about your work. And I encourage our audience to be on the lookout for the publication of Trauma, Religion,